What's up, everybody? KT Vindicare here. And I just finished the final episode of Season 7 of The Clone Wars, and I'm still processing it a little bit. But man, man, what a finale. What a finale. In terms of being a finale, that's probably the best Star Wars finale that there ever has been. I mean, Return of the Jedi was a great movie, but I think in terms of just pure, this is how we wrap everything up. I think Clone Wars might have it beat because this whole series, not just this season, but the entire series, it does so much to make the prequels just that much better. It does it in a way where, like, sure, it answers some things that, like, people had a problem with. It kind of covers up some of the problems that people had with the prequels, and I love it for that. I always have. I love it for that. But it also makes the good moments of the prequels that much better. And that's what season 7 is all about. Because season 7 is all about making the Revenge of the Sith. It just makes everything better in Revenge of the Sith. It really does. It makes everything better. And I mean, the ending itself. I mean, this is a spoiler like thing, so there's spoilers in here because I'm going to talk about some other stuff too. But the ending itself, it's been like 6 or 7 years since I first saw the very first episode of Clone Wars, way back when, and I had an issue with Ahsoka. I think everyone did. I'm like, wait a second. Darth Vader's got an apprentice? Where did this come from? Or Anakin Skywalker had an apprentice? Where did this come from? Like, she felt like initially, and then she was like all like gabby and annoying, and she was like this young little girl, and she was constantly being arrogant and getting herself into trouble and everything else like that. And at first, I'm thinking to myself, man, who this is them doing the appeal to kids thing, like where they were like, oh, we need a plucky little teenager for all the kids to identify with. And at first, that's kind of how I felt. I'm like, okay, I guess she's kind of cool. I guess, like, it's cool that Anakin Skywalker has someone to banter with. But over time, the relationship that those two had and the way that it developed, it truly became like as good as, maybe not quite as good, but it became really damn good. Like almost to the point where it was like as good as Obi-Wan and Anakin. And the only reason why it's not better than Obi-Wan and Anakin is because Anakin and Obi-Wan's relationship became so much better, so much more believable throughout the entirety of the Clone Wars series. When you get to that point in The Revenge of the Sith, where Anakin and Obi-Wan are looking at each other and they're just bantering back and forth about how Anakin gets to spend his glorious time with the politicians and everything. And there's like a little quip in there somewhere too where it's like, don't be a fool, you're the closest thing I've ever had to a father. When you see the entirety of it's all implied that like there's this time skip and they've been fighting alongside each other. They've been master and apprentice for so long. But to see all of that like really portrayed on screen, and to see like even Obi-Wan's struggles and his hardships and everything. Like, it's not, the whole thing's not just about Anakin Skywalker. There's plenty of development that you get with Obi-Wan too. And where was I going with this? I was talking about Ahsoka because over time, and Star Wars Rebels has a lot to do with this too, but nowhere near as much credit. But over time, Ahsoka Tano became such a dear character. You see her progression. Yeah, she starts off young and plucky and annoying because she's an arrogant little teenager. She's this Force prodigy that's really powerful, and she thinks she's really powerful, but she's nowhere near as skilled as she thinks she is. And Anakin has to come to her rescue a lot, and Obi-Wan has to come to the rescue of both of them too, a lot. But you get to see the development that she goes through. Like, you get to see her mature. You get to see how much more powerful she becomes. Like, in the beginning, Ventress was like, she couldn't touch Ventress. Like, even Anakin couldn't really defeat Ventress. And then over time, you're like, oh my god, like Ahsoka Tano could beat the crap out of Ventress now because she's been in combat all this time and her power has been growing so steadily throughout the course of the series. And by the time you get to season 7, there's this feeling of dread over the entirety of the season because you know where this is going. You know how this has to end. And even though you know exactly how it's going to end or how it's supposed to end, you still start to really feel like the sadness and the dread and the tragedy of all of it. Because you get to see that, maybe if Ahsoka was there, maybe if she wasn't off doing this other thing, maybe if she had been by Anakin's side that whole time, maybe she wouldn't have fallen. Or maybe he wouldn't have fallen. Maybe she could have saved him. Maybe she could have, And it makes her whole thing at the end of in Rebels when she fights Darth Vader and she says, I won't leave you, not this time. Like, now you truly understand, like, how she felt. Because the two of them together were, like, they were the closest people in each other's lives. Maybe not necessarily for Anakin, because he did have Padme. But, like, Anakin had 3 people in the entire world that he cared about. He cared about Obi-Wan, he cared about Padme, and he cared about Ahsoka. Those are the only people that he cared about. And, it's always been his weakness. A Jedi is not supposed to form attachments, but that's been established a long time ago that Anakin was like the one thing that it broke for him. So even though you know how this season's supposed to end, you still are like dreading to see it coming. And then as it all starts to collapse on itself, as everything starts to get set in motion, all of a sudden you're just sitting there going like, oh man, I have to live this whole thing all over again. Like that powerful moment where you don't hear any dialogue in Revenge of the Sith. All it is just action shots and music. You get that whole thing all over again. And then you have the relationship between Ahsoka and Captain Rex. Small little thing here before I forget about it. There was like a thing that came up where I was like, wait a second. He calls himself Captain Rex in Star Wars Rebels. How come he was promoted to Commander? How come he wasn't Commander Rex later in the show? And Filoni even addresses that. Like, the series even addresses something that small in this finale. So that all the continuity fits together like a glove. And, like, by the time you're done with all of it, I was looking for gaps. I mean, where are the gaps? Like, there's no plot holes or anything. Like, all the continuity is sewn together so tight and so well that you're left going, like, there's nothing for me to complain about. I mean, there's individual issues, like, here and there that are really tiny, like, that Jar Jar Binks episode. I kind of like it, but I know a lot of other people don't because they don't like Jar Jar Binks, but that's just one small episode in a big, long, continuous story. So even that small stuff, you can't really complain about. And this is leading me into my other thing, because it's like, it's so sad that all the problems that fans like me have had with the sequels gets buried under this blanket statement of like, oh, well, they're just Star Wars fans being Star Wars fans. You can't satisfy Star Wars fans. Star Wars fans are toxic. Star Wars fans are this, blah, 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 blah. Well, hang on a minute, guys. Hang on a minute. Have you seen the Star Wars subreddit? Have you seen Twitter? Have you seen YouTube? Every single Star Wars fan that has seen it loves Clone Wars. And maybe it's for the best that Filoni was never writing this show. This show was never being made for your casual moviegoer that wants to be part of the Star Wars experience. No, this has always been Star Wars for Star Wars fans. Because your average viewer isn't going to watch it. It's a cartoon on Cartoon Network, and now it's like a cartoon that's on Disney+. Nobody that's not already a Star Wars fan is going to care about that, is going to watch that. So they had to cater the entire show for people that are longtime Star Wars fans, and they put Star Wars fans in charge of creating it. So now when you get to the conclusion, and you start looking at the reactions that everyone has had from this series, it's pretty much unanimous. It's unanimous. And a lot of the problems that I had with the sequels aren't in this. And I can point to a lot of like really important reasons why. Okay, so here's like a criticism that I hear that gets thrown around a lot when people are talking about, oh, toxic Star Wars fans. Oh, toxic Star Wars fans, they just didn't want a female protagonist. Well, look at Season 7 and look at Clone Wars as a whole. Ahsoka Tano is the protagonist of this story. And she is a lot of the same things that Rey is, except she's a lot of the things that Rey isn't, too. Number 1, she's believable. Number 2, she's developed. Number 3, she's imperfect. Number 4, she goes through sufferings and she goes through failures. Her biggest failure is that she could have saved Anakin Skywalker, and she didn't. And she couldn't. And she has to live with that guilt. Like, Ahsoka Tano is the female protagonist that Star Wars fans deserved. She's what Rey should have been. We should have had a character that was this developed, that we grew to care about this much, that had this much personality. She is the character that it flies in the face. It's like, no, it's not just that we don't like female protagonists. We just like well-written ones. That's all. How is that like not obvious to everybody? And then like and that's like the big one. Okay, that's the big one. But there's so many other things too. It's like I love how the Clone Wars they spent a considerable amount of time delving into the relationship between the clones. That was one of my favorite things that they did in this series. They gave the clones names. They talked about how the clones are all genetic copies of one another, but like they all wanted to still have a personality because they're all still alive. There's like this underlying resentment that the clones have, that they were born for just this existence. And a lot of the clones are actually, or not a lot of them, but some of them are actually at the point where they're growing resentful of the fact that this is all they were ever born and bred to do. There's that wonderful episode where Captain Rex comes across a clone deserter on a planet who's adopted himself a family. I mean, come on. Like, this is it's opening up the lore, and it's making it personal and relatable. There's, like, the series goes and deals with, like, the back lore of all of the different, a lot of the different popular alien species, like the Twi'leks, like the calamari, like, the Picts and the Hutts. There's a whole thing on the Hutts too, as a matter of fact. And maybe what I'm getting at here is maybe the reason why all of this was so good was because it was done using long-form storytelling. It was done over the course of many seasons in a TV show, rather than everything being crammed together in a 2 or a 3 hour movie. Or 2 hour movie, because no one wants to watch a 3 hour movie. But maybe that's why. Maybe that's the easy explanation for why all of this story was done so well. And maybe the reason why the plot of the sequel sucks so much is because they didn't have time to... they didn't have enough movie time to like build a brand new story for you. Well, I mean, I could easily argue that you definitely could tell a good story within the course of one trilogy. I mean, the original trilogy did it, but it definitely gets harder, and I'm understanding that. I'm trying to be, a little understanding here. It does get more difficult when you're trying to like interweave all of this new story and make like a continuity that makes sense with like the previous material. But the sequels like barely even try to do that. Like they barely even they're just like, oh, you're just supposed to accept this and we're just going to gloss over everything. Whereas the Clone Wars, because it has the advantage of having long form storytelling, it goes into all of the details. It gets you all that stuff. I mean, even in the beginning, it kind of feels a little slow that way, but it's worth it. It pays off. Like when you're telling a story the longer you spend developing everything, developing the world, developing the story, developing the characters, like when you take your time to do that, and then in this case, when you take your time to adapt that story to what's already existed, then it comes out so much better. It's like when you take your time when you're baking a cake. If you just throw everything in there, sure, you'll have a cake. But if you take your time, measure everything completely, put care and love into it, as moms and grandmas have always said, it comes out so much better. But then there's a second, way more obvious reason for why the Clone Wars story is good and the sequel trilogy story is not. Well, because the Clone Wars had the same people as writers throughout the entire thing. They had Dave Filoni was the main guy, and then he had all of his stories and writers. They had the same team. Everything was cleared with George Lucas, who again is the main guy for Star Wars as a whole. They had to clear everything with him, and then he approved it all. And it was like a single organized hierarchy that was consistent throughout the entire course of the series. So the series could have ended out bad if the writing was bad from the beginning, but they at least got their chance to tell the story they wanted to tell because they didn't have this outside interference. They didn't have like this constant like shuffling around of directors and writers and producers and all this other nonsense that's going on inside of behind the scenes over at Lucasfilm. So maybe that's why this series is so much better than what the sequels were. And then maybe it's because it's just Star Wars content made for Star Wars fans by Star Wars fans. And maybe that's the easiest answer of all of it. I mean, this is the reason why Mandalorian is so good. But Mandalorian's 8 episodes long. It's barely gotten a chance to get off the ground. So, this is how good I'm hoping Mandalorian becomes. And because it's live action, it makes it more accessible to a lot of people. I don't get why a lot of people don't want to watch a CGI cartoon. It's still a very good medium for storytelling. I mean, ask any anime fan. You can tell a very good story if it's just animated. Okay? And I want to talk about one last thing before I end this video, which is that final scene with Vader looking over the crash of the Star Destroyer that had Ahsoka and Rex in it. Not a single word of dialogue is uttered in that scene, and it's so damn powerful. And it goes back, and this scene answers a question that I had way back then about Ahsoka, where I'm like, and I said it in this video already, if Anakin Skywalker had an apprentice, how come no one ever talks about her? How come he didn't look for her? Did he kill her too? When he was doing the Jedi Purge? If that's the case, how come she's like living again in Rebels? How did she come back? What happened? How come Darth Vader, who knew that Ahsoka Tano was alive, how come he didn't search for her? Well, because he thought she was dead. Because he found the wreckage and not a single word needed to be said, but you could just see it in his face and that's the thing about Darth Vader, is that yeah, sure, he's this big, cold shell of a person now, but he still has feelings buried underneath all that. He still felt loss when Padme died. I mean, in the movies, it does it in a very stupid and cheesy way, but it's still meant to convey that even as he becomes Darth Vader, even as he descends into the dark side, he still has feelings for those people that he cares about, which is why Luke is able to redeem him at the end of Return of the Jedi. And, I mean, that's the thing about this show, is that it makes everything so much better. It just makes it better. It doesn't take anything away. It doesn't try to belittle any of the achievements of any of the other characters. It just grows, it just adds on to it. It's everything the sequels should have been. If only you had given the sequels over to people who actually love Star Wars. And that's my rave. I'll see you guys next time.